following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis. As always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we leave the sports realm and we go into true crime. We got Maureen Boyle here, and she has just published a book within the last year called Shallow Graves, The Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer. And the story is very close to me because I do live in Bristol County, which New Bedford is. And this case is a case that was probably the biggest in the late 80s since the Boston Strangler in the 1960s. The case has not been solved yet. I don't use the word closure because I know my guest today will tell me there is no closure. The families still grieving after 30 years. But the case has not been solved. We're going to go back into the 80s. We're going to go through this terrible time period in the New Bedford area in just a moment. But you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. And boy, we have so many good shows, so many good podcasts on sports and news. And, of course, I have branched out with celebrities, like you can always listen to me, and Greg Brady. Barry Williams was on my show, Gloria Loring, and Matthew Polly, who wrote the first definitive biography of Kung Fu legend Bruce Lee. He was on my show earlier this year, and I'm branching out. And today I'm going to be talking about true crime. And one of the things is I was always fascinated by true crime. I grew up in a time, in New York City when you had the 44 serial killer, David Berkowitz, since I was probably about 7 years old. And it always fascinated me. Ted Bundy, Gacy, all these people always had a fascination with the dark side. And this case in Massachusetts, it's still going on. And it's been 30 years. It's, like I said before, it's probably the biggest one since the Boston Strangler. Maureen Boyle was on the scene 30 years ago. She was the first one to break the story. She is an award-winning journalist, has been a crime reporter in New England for more than 25 years, including the Standard Times in New Bedford during the serial murder case. And currently she is Director of Journalism Program at Stonehill College. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Maureen.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion with you. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Oh, I'm lively. You're going to find that. Let me ask you something. You grew up in Bridgeport. Again, Bridgeport is not a well-to-do town. It's a rundown town, a lot of criminals. I think New York made a penitentiary there in the late 1800s, and now you crossed over from Connecticut to New Bedford. Were there any parallels between the two cities?
I think one of the parallels are hardworking people, because while Bridgeport, there are some sections of Bridgeport, Connecticut that are really very, very rough, but there are other areas of the city which are very nice. I'm thinking in particular one area that is really close to Fairfield, called Block Rock, which is right on the water. And that's a beautiful, beautiful area there, as well as the north end of the city. In some of the parallels between the two communities, New Bedford is a fishing community and also had been a manufacturing hub. The same with Bridgeport. Bridgeport, for the longest time, really was home to a lot of major manufacturing plants, particularly during World War II. So there are some real parallels between the two communities, not necessarily involving crime, but in terms of hardworking people from a variety of backgrounds and immigrants coming into the community and working very, very hard. What I learned in Bridgeport was to don't judge people and really listen to people's stories. And in New Bedford, I that really came in handy, and I was fascinated by the stories that people told and the lives that they had.
Now, what brought you to New Bedford? Because I think you worked for the Hartford Courant for a while, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I had when I was in college, I interned at what was then called the Bridgeport Post, and then I had interned while I was in college at the Hartford Courant, and from there I went up to New Hampshire, worked for the Union Leader in New Hampshire right out of college, covering as everyone who works in New Bedford covers at some point all of the politicians who want to be president as they go through there. And from there, I went down to New Bedford.
What I learned about New Bedford through your book, and because I had a lot of court cases down there many years ago, is that I knew it was a predominantly Portuguese community, but it almost sounded like my neighborhood in Brooklyn. People knew each other. It was a small community within a community. Everyone knew each other, and you were on the streets talking to people all the time.
Yes, and that is something that really resonated with me in New Bedford, that everyone does know each other, and they're very strong neighborhoods. You know, just like in Bridgeport, just like when you were growing up, there is that strong sense of community in these small neighborhoods. You know, people will travel, immigrate from across an ocean, and then never leave the city that their adopted home. And on the streets, I really developed a love for the city of New Bedford. It is just really a lovely, lovely community that gets a bad rap. And in some ways, that keeps the housing costs down. And I consider New Bedford the best kept secret in the state. It's a city that's right on the water. It's got a really lush history that I think it rivals anywhere else in the state, and it's just a beautiful waterfront community.
You know, I think it was with whales. I read a lot of casing on whaling cases where the whalers marked their territory where they were allowed to go whaling. Moby Dick came from there. Frederick Douglass was there. A lot of histories in New Bedford. But unfortunately, 70s, 80s, you got cocaine and heroin moving in. Let's talk about the decay of the community during that time.
Yeah, when heroin moved into the city, that really devastated a number of families. And unfortunately, no one talked about the heroin epidemic at that time. And I really do believe that if people had paid more attention, other than in the city, and treatment had been available, more treatment had been available then, I really think that we would have been ahead of the game today in terms of the opioid epidemic of today. Back then, when heroin was coming into the area there, no one wanted to talk about it. Just as in today, a number of the addicts were from middle-class families, and a number of them were from the suburbs. And you really saw the toll that it took on individuals when people would come into court when they were first addicted and they would get arrested. Young, very vibrant looking, and then over a period of years, you really saw the toll that it took on their bodies. And you wonder, the toll that it took on their families, because no one really wanted to talk about it. And families were very, very embarrassed about, having children that were addicted to heroin. It was not something people talked about.
And like you said, it was, what shocked me here, and of course I know it shocked you because I did my homework and I said, a lot of these folks are middle class. They got hooked on heroin. They used to buy these small packages for like $20 or something, or maybe $50.
Yep.
And so when they couldn't get their money, they became either street workers or part-time prostitutes. One person, I think, was married, and she went out one night.
Yeah.
I can't remember who, and she didn't come back.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Once women who were addicted to heroin, once their addiction became so severe, that's when they were on the street. And the amount of money that they earned with each trick would be the exact amount for a packet of heroin at that time. I mean, the price of heroin now is much cheaper, but at that time it was a 1-for-1. And it didn't happen overnight. And when people talk about prostitution as a victimless crime, no, that's not true. The victims are the women that are on the street because they are addicted to drugs and it is fueling their addiction. It's not helping them. It's really using them. So that is why the women were on the street. Just to get the heroin.
And what's interesting here is you talk about there was crimes every day with these women. They're either getting abused or being held up or knives and stuff. So crime was always involved with the prostitutes as well.
Yes, a lot of the women did not report crimes because they felt people weren't going to believe them, or let's say they skipped out on a court date and they were wanted on a warrant for failing to appear in court. You have to remember the women who were addicted to heroin, even those that were not working the streets, and there were many of women who were addicted to heroin who were not working the streets. It was a progression. They would do bad checks. They'd write bad checks. They would shoplift. They would steal. They were all crimes that were at a much lower level. They were not violent crimes. They were not hurting people. They were hurting themselves more than anything. And then the progression was really harming themselves when their addiction was so bad and they wound up on the street. But all of the crimes that any of the female addicts at the time, all of their crimes were really crimes that hurt them eventually.
Now, you begin the book with Nancy Paiva. I think I'm saying her name right.
Nancy Paiva, yes.
Nancy Paiva.
Yeah.
Now, again, because all this is very important for the timeline, no bodies have been discovered yet. As of July of 1988, she goes missing. She goes missing July 7th. Now, her sister, I think, if I recall in the book, she's coming down the highway July 30th, and she sees police all over the place at the at the other side. Let's describe that.
Yeah, her sister Judy had seen Nancy the day before that she went missing, and Nancy had 2 children, teenage girls. Her sister. It was a very, very hot summer. The summer of 1988 was one of the hottest anyone could remember. Not unlike this past summer. There's a couple month this past summer when it was just absolutely deadly hot. Very, very similar to what it was like in 1988. Judy had taken the family to Fall River, to the pool in Fall River, just to get out of the city, to cool off. And on the way back, while her husband's driving, she looks over on 195 onto the opposite side of 195, the Reed Road, further past the Reed Road exit. You're heading towards the Dartmouth Mall, and she sees a lot of police cars, and she yells at her husband, stop, that's my sister over there. And, of course, everyone's looking at her like, yeah, you're crazy. And she began thinking to herself, of course, that's not my sister. And they just kept on driving. Well, it turned out that was her sister that she saw being pulled out of the woods, which was, to her, in retrospect, very, very chilling. Unfortunately, Nancy's remains were not identified until December of 1988. So during that whole period of time, from July of 88 to December of 88, she had no idea that was her sister who was pulled out of the woods.
And the thing is that, again, this is just an isolated incident at this moment. But you did have a detective John Dextranger, I think his name is.
Yeah, John Dextrator. Yeah, he worked in a long-time detective in John Dextrator is a long-time detective in the New Bedford Police Department. Covered property crimes, covered homicides, as just about everyone in there did. Everyone did a little bit of everything. And he had taken the police report for Nancy Paiva's disappearance. Nancy's boyfriend at the time came in to report her missing. Her boyfriend was not someone who would voluntarily go into a police department, so that's what really piqued his interest. He actually thought that the boyfriend killed her, but he was wrong. But he took the police report. He had been investigating other attacks on women on the street and some previous homicides of women who were last seen leaving bars. So he was attuned to that there was something he just had a weird feeling. And he had later discovered that there were a number of women who had similar height, similar weight, who went missing from roughly March of 1988 to September of 1988. And he did wonder whether there was some correlation between them, whether they were all these disappearances were linked. And he had gone to the district attorney's office to share his concerns, and that eventually led to the DA's office bringing in some search dogs to look for additional bodies. But by the time the dog came in, there was there were 3 bodies had been found by the time the dogs came in, and found more bodies.
And again, it's turning up in November and December of '88.
Yep.
Now the dog came from Connecticut. Andy Redmond, I think, is the name.
Yes.
They brought him in. Why go so far? Didn't we have some dogs here in Massachusetts?
The dogs in Massachusetts were not what would be called cadaver dogs. They were still in training. Most of the dogs in Massachusetts were cross-trained because having a police canine, it's expensive. And most of the canines in Massachusetts were trained for drug or crime control, crowd control, but primarily drug dogs. They weren't especially trained to find bodies. There was one trooper. She was working at training her dog to get better at finding bodies. So she was working closely with Andy to try and get her dog up to speed and to get her dog better trained for body detection. But his dog was considered one of the best in the country, and he was considered one of the best trainers in the country. So his dog, they brought in the best dog around, and the dog's name was Josie, and it was a beautiful, beautiful animal. And found the dogs. I found the bodies fairly quickly.
And let me ask you something. Now, you were at the New Bedford Standard at the time. And,
yes.
And you were the one covering this. When did you realize there might be a link between these bodies?
Well, I'd been a long-time police reporter in New Bedford, and technically at that time I was general assignment, not police reporter. I was general assignment and politics of all things. But I still covered some police stories and maintained strong contact with a number of investigators throughout Bristol County. I had covered some earlier murders involving women who had been last seen leaving bars. I had done a number of stories about the girls who worked the streets and heroin addiction amongst women in the community. So I really was in tune to those who were out there and needed help. So when the first 2 bodies were found, they were found on weekends, and the weekend reporter had covered those. So I was keeping track of what was going on there, and then as it was really clear that with the number of missing persons reports came in, that's when it was clear that there was something else that was going on, and I spoke at length with John Dextrator about that because he also had that same concern of, there's something not right going on.
And when
keep in mind that the missing persons reports did not all come in at once, and just as the bodies weren't discovered all at once, and people do go missing all the time. So there was no big alarm that went out when people started going missing. They went missing over a period of weeks and months. There wasn't anything that gave anyone even a hint that they were snatched off the street and murdered. There was two cases in particular that did set off alarms, and that was Nancy Paiva and the disappearance of Mary Rose Santos, because they had a really definitive timeline and they were reported missing almost immediately. In the other cases, unfortunately, the families didn't realize that the individuals had gone missing because they weren't living at home, and the people that were closest to them at the time did not report them missing immediately. For example, Deborah Medeiros, who was the first woman who went missing, whose remains were found. She was found in Freetown the 4th of July weekend. She had gone missing in the spring. Her boyfriend did not report her missing. He contacted her mom and asked if she was over there because they got in an argument and she stormed out of the house where they were living. He contacted her mom. Her mom hadn't heard from her. So there was a period of time before her family reported her missing in Fall River to Fall River Police. So her missing persons report was not she wasn't reported missing in New Bedford. And there was a number of, there's other women who were either not reported missing or they were reported missing much later after they are believed to have vanished.
Now, when did the district attorney's office decide, hey, that's Ronald Pena, I think. He was the district attorney at the time. We'll go into him as well. We'll say, when did he say, look, I got to form a task force here? Because when I speak of Ronald Pena, again, the politics come right in because there was something political that happened and he got mad, he fired everyone, and so the troopers didn't like his office and his office didn't like certain troopers. Let's try to clear up that mess that I'm trying to sort through right now.
So what happened is there wasn't a quote unquote task force per se. What it was the state police were in charge of the investigation, but they were working with the detectives in the communities where the bodies were found. So that for the bodies that were found in Freetown, they were working with the Freetown detective. For the bodies that were found in Dartmouth, different detectives were paired up with them. And because the women who were believed to have last been seen in New Bedford, that's when New Bedford police were also involved in the case in working with the state police. But keep in mind, it wasn't a quote-unquote New Bedford case because none of the women were found dead in New Bedford. So it's not listed as an unsolved New Bedford homicide. It's listed as an unsolved homicides in Freetown, Dartmouth, Westport, and Marion. So
that's
it's
like 15 minutes if you do a whole circle.
It's a circle around New Bedford. It's a highway circle around New Bedford. New Bedford, the center, and then look at all the lines of the highway going off of it. So it was. So they all met and worked together and figured out ways to split up the work. They worked closely. They also worked with the FBI. in terms of getting items tested and tap into some of their expertise. But keep in mind, we're talking 1988. That was a completely different era when it comes to DNA. There was no touch DNA at the time. DNA was really just starting to be introduced as evidence in court cases. It was very, very new at the time. They needed very large, they needed very large samples at that time to be tested for DNA, and sometimes those samples were destroyed in the testing process, so they were being very, very careful.
And not only that,
people weren't using cell phones then. There weren't many surveillance cameras. Most of the surveillance cameras were in banks. A very, very different world at that time.
Your telephone on your wall was faster than computers back then.
Yes, yes, very much so. I mean, the computers that they were using, I was talking with a member of the Bristol County Drug Task Force, who was in charge of the Drug Task Force at that time, and he was really be considered a computer geek at that time. And the computer that they were using in the Drug Task Force was, considered the fastest you can imagine, and it was basically as fast as an old iPod. So that gives you an idea of what they were dealing with. The space that they had on the first computers that they used was equivalent of a photo file, of an MP3 file.
That's very small, as we all know.
Yeah, very, very small. So it was different. They were still typing on typewriters in many cases.
I remember when the typewriter finally got, you were able to make corrections, and you had to whine out of It's just like, you sat in the newsroom, for God's sakes, and had all that noise going around you, and you had to get deadlines and stuff, so you know more than that than I do. I just had to do it for college and law school. By the time I got to law school, 1 year we were using typewriters. Next year the laptop came out. By 1993, things had changed. But they didn't even have the universal database like you have today, where you just plug in. And I mean, they were literally going by the old methods, the old methods of like what you see with a Humphrey Bogart film. You got to go out there, hit the street, and get some witnesses.
Yep, that's exactly what they were doing. But they didn't have you're correct. They didn't have a database where that they could search to say, okay, let's look for every white truck or every green truck, or check names. There was not. They could not do that with ease.
And you had two Massachusetts state troopers, Marianne Dill and Jose Gonzalez, or Gonzalez.
Josie Gonzalez.
Josie?
Josie Gonzalez and Marianne Dill. The two of them were the primary investigators in the case, but they worked with everyone that was there. They also worked with a New Bedford detective by the name of Richie Ferreira, and they worked very well with everyone else that was in the DA's unit, along with narcotics detectives and detectives in all the other communities. And they'll be the first to say that it was very much a cooperative team effort. But they were the ones who were, really were the lead investigators in the case.
Now, I read in one of your interviews, because afterwards you just plow through thousands of pages of crime reports and police login time for this. Even in the book you mentioned, they were eating up their overtime that the state gave them. Was there an assumption by people that maybe the cops weren't working so hard? Because later on you found out these guys were working this day and night, but back then frustration set in. We got a set of 9 bodies found, 2 are still missing, they were never recovered. was there a sense of urgency amongst the victims' families? We got to get this guy. And do you think that, harbored some kind of resentment against law enforcement?
Well, the people in the general public, they only knew what the district attorney's office released. And obviously they don't release everything in a criminal investigation. And reporters were looking for as much information as possible, and the public was getting their information from the news media. And whatever information the news media was able to either get from the street, get from investigators, get from the DA's office. And of course there was some frustration. Some family members were convinced that investigators weren't doing quote unquote anything, weren't doing enough because the women were not from the suburbs, that they're drug addicted, and that quote unquote no one cared. But people did care that were investigating the case because they knew that these were people, and the situation that these women were in could affect any family at any time. We know that much more now today, but back then a number of people did have their head in the sand in the general community, not realizing how serious the drug problem was. But there was much more going on behind the scenes than the general public realized in terms of the investigation. There was a lot of, and I knew how hard they were working then, because I would see them out all the time when I was out working. But when I looked into, and I only saw a fraction of the investigative reports, there's much more out there, and I was surprised at how much additional work was done on the case than I had even realized. They really did cover everything that they could at the time that they knew of. And I've always been convinced that once the killer is identified, they'll be able to say, that he's right here. Oh my God! But there was no way to link him to things.
Now, of course, today, if this happened, I know you mentioned on other shows, do you think that he would have been, he or she, because I don't know either or, would be found quickly?
I think so. I think so because of cell phones, in terms of cell phone tracking, in terms of social media, in terms of a video. Back then, when women were on the street, if they had gotten into any vehicles, people would jot down license plate numbers. Today, people would be taking cell phone photos or video, and the person would have been identified very, very quickly.
And now let's talk about some of the suspects. We had a guy from Missouri who ended up in my town, in Attleboro. What's the story with him, of all people?
Well, he had been living there, but he was locked up in Missouri, and he was claiming that he was the killer, and they brought him back over here because he was locked up out there, flew him here, and he made the whole story up because he wanted to see his estranged wife. He never got to see his wife. He was lying to investigators, and they put him on a plane and sent him right back to Missouri.
And then we have... go ahead.
Yeah, and, there was an attorney in the city who was drug addicted and was using drug addicted women to buy him drugs. He obviously became a prime suspect in the case. And then there was another individual who was attacking women on the street. He picked them up and tried to choke them. Those were, just a few of the suspects.
Now, when I read the book, and the one who choked the prostitutes were Anthony DeGrazia, he, in my mind, was probably the most obvious, I would say, because he would have outbursts of violence, whereas Kenneth Ponte, the attorney, he was a drug dealer before law school, cleaned up his act, but now he's shooting cocaine in his neck. How the heck do you do that?
He would have the girls that he picked up on the street to shoot him up. He
was just weird. He wasn't angry. He just wanted people to hang around him. He was lonely. He'd make the girl strip, and he wouldn't even touch him.
No, but he was weird. But and he was not cooperating with authorities. So that early on, so that really was a red flag to investigators when he wasn't cooperating.
And he lived in Florida. I think he closed up his law practice here, and he moved to Florida. And so they were surveilling him, but he kept calling. And word got back to him that saying, "Hey, you might be a suspect here, pal. What's going on here?"
Yeah, he's quite a odd individual, to say the least. I think he would be a defense attorney's worst nightmare in some cases because you didn't know when to shut up. But he'd call reporters, and he'd call call the DA's office, he was just a strange man.
But
to say the least.
Ronald Pena believed he had enough to go to the grand jury and try to get an indictment against him. Yeah,
and he did get an indictment against him.
Yeah, and I don't understand how, because they didn't have all that evidence. That's the biggest thing that puzzled me, being an attorney. I was like, how can they just do this? Because Gonsalves and Dill didn't believe the evidence was strong enough, and I think they said something like, if you don't see us in court, we don't believe in prosecution's case.
But as you well know, for an indictment, it's the level of proof is much lower. That's just grand jurors deciding yes, we could. We believe that there's enough evidence to charge someone. Doesn't mean that there's enough evidence to convict someone. And that's all that they needed. And it doesn't have to be unanimous. So, and that's why that charge did not hold up once Ron Pena was no longer DA.
My thing is, why did he fight so hard for Ponte? Because then he lost, running for the DA, and the next DA came in and said, this is totally, what was the difference between the two?
Two very, very different styles. They are very, very different individuals, very different styles as prosecutors. Ron Pena really was quite a brilliant manager and an individual. He really did know, as DA, how to pick the right people in his office. He really did hire some of the brightest young prosecutors you can imagine. And in terms of being a visionary, he really was. But he also liked the Boston television cameras too. He came across very well in the media, came across very well on TV, and he was very, very well spoken. He had a very much a different style than his successor, Paul Walsh. Paul Walsh was did not conduct business with that type of flash.
And what's interesting here, you teach, you've taught, and you still do, now you're the director, you've taught at Easton at Stonehill College since 2004. The case has been laying around for 30 years, but one of your students, one of the victims, were related, I believe.
Yes. Yep.
Now,
and that goes to say that tell you, it is very, very much a small world, and you never know what you do, how it will touch someone's life, and that was you just never know.
And let me ask you something. After 30 years, to go back into time, and I've read, I'll ask the question, it does look like mine. It's a mess of notes and pens and everything scrawled, because you probably do the same kind of old thing that I do. Everything's scattered all over the place, and, pads and books and reports all over all over. My thing is, how long did it take you to literally gather everything after 30 years and put it into a book?
Probably about 2 years to physically do it. But I also went back and re-interviewed people. So I interviewed about 100 people for the book, and that's interviewed and re-interviewed a number of people. Josie and Marianne, the two troopers, were very, very gracious with their time, and we would meet about once a month for hours, going over the case and discussing, where they were and what they remembered, what they remembered seeing, what they remembered saying, and then going over even some of the dialogue, like the conversations that another investigator, Bob St. Jean, in the DA's office had with Kenny Pont. We went over that scene a couple of times as I was asking him, okay, what did Kenny say? What did you remember saying back to him? And then going over notes of that.
And what
so it was a long, detailed process.
Why, after all this time, for you to write the book, literally? It could have been written 20 years ago, for that matter.
No, it couldn't have.
No, it couldn't.
No, I don't think so. Well, but honestly, I really did think that I kept on waiting for someone to be arrested, and that was really the main delay in the book. I kept on fully expecting that someone would be arrested, and there would be the ending in the case. And unfortunately, there wasn't. And I discovered after all this time, people were, one, forgetting about what happened, and two, misremembering what had happened. They're relying on rumors, relying on stories that were told by other people, and it was there was a lot of misinformation out there. So I decided, now is the time to be writing to write the book. And one of the hopes, in addition to the killer being identified, is that somehow the two women that are still missing, that their remains will be found, so that their family members can finally bury them.
Let me ask you this: since all the girls were found outside of New Bedford, and I know that back then, like we mentioned, the DNA and all the other forensic stuff wasn't up to par, up to what today is. Do you think the girls were murdered in New Bedford and taken out to be dumped, or do you think they were taken out thinking they're going to go to a nice quiet spot and then killed and dumped?
I really have no idea. But for whatever reason, they were dumped outside of New Bedford. I have no idea whether that's something that the killer would know.
Yeah.
I don't know if they were killed in New Bedford and dumped outside, or killed someplace else and dumped over there. But they definitely were not killed in the area in the spot where they were found.
I think, after reading it, the killer knew the whole area around there, and he must have felt safe, or she felt safe, to dump the bodies there. And they were not, they were not buried deep into the ground. They were just pretty much off the highway, and you couldn't even see it. Now, most of these discoveries were by accident.
Yes, people who were stopping to relieve themselves, or state highway cleanup crews cleaning trash along the highway.
Yeah,
and then of course the dogs finding them. But that's the initial one. The initial two, the first two bodies were found. One by a woman who was needed to use the facilities as she was driving up 140 in Freetown. Now at that time there was 1988 Route 140 in Freetown going north. It was there wasn't a lot off the highway, and there weren't a lot of businesses around there. Very, very, very quiet. And so she pulled over and went into the brush, and then found the remains. And the second body was found by two men on motorcycles who needed to relieve themselves, pulled off to the side of the road and walked into the brush and found Nancy. So that's how. And in the 1980s, that area was not as built up as it is today. And late at night, there was not a lot of traffic.
And the roads are dark to begin with out there.
Yes. But I'll say in 1988, Route 140 where a number of the bodies were found was not a road well traveled. Today, it's very, very different. Today, there's a lot of traffic in comparison on Route 140 because people are commuting elsewhere for work.
And you know what's interesting here? Because when you think about what the killer is, who the killer is, we're talking about AIDS at the time. We're talking about cocaine. Yes. We're talking about lawyers, doctors, professional people going to these women that you just want to, like you mentioned, what are you thinking?
Yep. And obviously they weren't. And obviously they weren't thinking of the women that they were using. Who knows? But they were not being responsible.
And that just threw me. And I know some of the police were like shaking their heads, saying, "Oh my God, what are these guys thinking?" Let me ask you something. Did I leave out anything that you might want to share with my listeners?
Pardon?
No, is there anything else that I left out in my question that maybe?
Oh no. Well, if anyone has any information about the case, if they think that they know who the killer is, they should contact the state police in the Bristol County DA's office, or Andy Simmons, who is a detective in New Bedford Police Department, with their information. I mean, over a period of 30 years, back in 1988, people may have had a different lifestyle. They may have been afraid of someone. They may have been embarrassed. Maybe they didn't want to come forward because of fear. But today they may have a whole different life. They may be out of the area. Whoever they were afraid of may now be out of their lives. And they should come forward with whatever information that they have for authorities, because it could be that little thing that really does make a difference.
And let me ask you, do you think that soon we will find out the identity of the killer?
Yes.
That's good. And
I do. I really do, because to think otherwise would be that someone got away with 9, possibly 11 murders, and that none of us should accept that. That is not acceptable in our society, that someone could kill 11 people and get away with it. That it should not be allowed. Despite the fact that they were addicted to drugs, that does not make a difference, because they should have been allowed to recover from their addiction and return to their families whole. But someone stole that from them and stole that from their families. And someone needs to answer to that. And if the killer is dead, we all need to know that that's the case. And we all need to know who it was and what happened and why they did it. And we can all learn from it to prevent something like this from happening again.
And let me ask you, where can we find your book besides Amazon and Barnes & Nobles? Where can we get
the local bookstores, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Those are the two places. You can also follow me on Twitter. I always forget what my Twitter handle is, of course, but I have a book Facebook page. It would be Shallow Graves : search for the New Bedford Highway Killer, and there's also another page that's Shallow Graves. It has a picture of the book on it. But remember, it's : there's another page that you have to join. That's not the book page. And also I have an author's page on Facebook. If any of your listeners are on Twitter, my Twitter handle is Maureen Boyle 1 and our number 1. And we also have a website, shallowgravesthebook.com. And I can be reached through any of those social media outlets. And I respond to any messages that people send.
And that's fantastic, Maureen. It's such a great book. I'm gonna end the show, like all my listeners know, and then I get to talk to you for about a minute after. So hang on.
All right. Well, and again, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it, and thank you to all your listeners for tuning in.
Thank you, Maureen. Just hold the line for 1 second, folks. Go out, get this book, Shallow Graves. Great read. Police investigation, district attorney's office, the families of the victims. A very powerful book. Great under a Hanukkah bush or a Christmas tree or Kwanzaa, whatever it is. Pick it up. Great read. Hopefully we'll find the killer. I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Maureen. And in the immortal words of one of my heroes, Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck.
The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.